My name is Andrew Ahn Westover, and I am the Key Pairing Director of Education and Public Engagement here at the New Museum. I join you today from the unceded land of Lenape people, and I'd like to begin by acknowledging and paying respect to Lenape people and elders and ancestors, past, present, and future. On behalf of the New Museum, I am glad to welcome you to this book launch for Saturation, Race, Art, and the Circulation of Value. Saturation is the fourth book in the Critical Anthologies of Art and Culture series, which is co-published by the New Museum and MIT Press. This program will feature an introduction from the book's co-editors, C. Riley Snorton and Hentyle Yapp, followed by a panel of artist contributors, Kent Monkman, Tourmaline, and Xandra Ibarra, moderated by Richard Fung. In a moment, Riley and Hentyle will share more about the book and introduce our panel. Before we begin, however, I would like to thank some of the people and organizations who have helped make this possible. First, thank you to all who contributed to this anthology. These texts are definitionally team efforts, and I want to particularly thank my predecessor, Johanna Burton, for her exemplary leadership of this series, as well as the current and former museum staff members whose work helped realize this text, including Jean Goswami, Kate Weiner, and Maggie Mustard, along with many others. I also want to thank staff members Andrea Calderes and Derek Wright for their help bringing today's program together. The Critical Anthologies in Art and Culture are supported by the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. Additional support is provided by the Research and Residencies Council of the New Museum. New Museum digital initiatives are generously supported by Hermione and David B. Heller. I'd also like to offer a special thank you to the co-sponsors for today's program, the Asia Pacific American Institute, and the Department of Art and Public Policy at New York University, and to the Center for the Study of Gender and Sexuality and the Center for the Study of Race, Politics, and Culture at University of Chicago. We also thank our members and supporters, like you, who help make these programs possible. Finally, we have several upcoming public programs, as well as a full suite of artist videos, exhibition walkthroughs, making activities for families, and more, which I encourage you to check out on our website, newmuseum.org. And now, without further ado, I turn the conversation over to Riley and Hentyle.
Good afternoon, and thank you, Andrew. My name is C. Riley Snorton, and I'm a professor at the University of Chicago.
And I'm Hentyle Yapp, a professor at NYU, and together we co-edited Saturation, Race, Art, and the Circulation of Value.
Today's event is an opportunity to celebrate the contributors to this collection and to reflect on some of the questions posed in it about the institutional limits of representational politics and artistic practice, the need to attend to social difference alongside structures of power, and on the insistence on more pleasure and other ways to cope. Our moderator for today is Richard Fung, who is an artist, writer, and professor emeritus in the Faculty of Art at OCAD University. In a discussion of Fung's seminal essay, Looking for My Penis, Jose Esteban Munoz heralds Fung's work as privileging a Marxist, sensuous contemplation over abstract thinking, whereby the former is a mode of saying and doing that makes one conscious of the actual material conditions of reality, the contingencies that structure the world and organize power. Our book draws from this frame to consider the aesthetic alongside social structure, so as to expand discussions around race and the art world beyond debates over representation.
So to do this, the book relies on saturation for its organizing concept. We use this frame as it provides space to think about the scientific, visual, corporeal, and sonic. And I know that there's versions of available of the introduction that kind of outline these ideas. Put differently, saturation not only describes the sensory, but also brings to the fore the methods, approaches, and structures that come to bear on how sensations are felt and embodied, elements of Munoz's sensuous contemplation. We wanted to briefly, very briefly, offer a sense of the book's larger framing in the world, larger framing in order to bring us to this main event. As much as we are excited to celebrate the release of this book, we also wanted to primarily offer a space to hear more from some of its contributors. With this in mind, we are so excited to have these amazing artists speak with us and each other about these questions around aesthetics, politics, and social structures, or in other words, modes of sensuous contemplation. The focus for today's event is one particular theme that arose in saturation.
So in particular, we wanted to explore the limits of art and activism and how artists who are considered political and activists do not necessarily find parity across art and activism, but rather real disconnects. Rather than viewed simply as problem, these disconnects rethink the relationship across art and politics, particularly in a moment when activism is being re-envisioned. So without further ado, we'll turn now to the artist and thinker that inspired the approach to sensuous contemplation, Richard Fung. Thanks so much, Richard.
Thank you so much, Riley and Hentyle. Thanks for inviting me to moderate this discussion of this with these fantastic artists in this very important book. And I also want to thank everyone at the New Museum for facilitating this discussion. I'm speaking today from Toronto, which is in the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, and the Huron-Wendat, who are the original owners and custodians of the land on which I live and work. Joining me today are three wonderful artists and activists who will each do a ridiculously short 5-minute introduction to their work, just so that you can situate them. In order, and I won't come back, they will just go one after each other. We have Xandra Ibarra, Oakland-based artist and community organizer with Survived and Punished, California. Kent Monkman, Cree artist who works in painting, installation, performance, and video. And Tourmaline, an artist and filmmaker whose works include Salacia or Salacia, I'm not sure how you pronounce it, I should have asked, Mary of Ill Fame, Atlantic is a Sea of Bones, The Personal Things, Lost in the Music, and Happy Birthday, Marcia. She's also an editor of Trapdoor, an anthology on transcultural production published by the New Museum and MIT Press. Tourmaline has been working with the Barnard Center for Research on Women since 2014 and is currently an artist in residence at the BCRW Social Justice Institute. So I will now turn it over. Let's start with Xandra.
Hi, everybody. I hope you're doing okay on this fine pandemic day. Since we were invited to on this panel to discuss our work in relation to art and activism, I wanted to start with a collaborative work between myself and some co-organizers that I work with, Elisa Bieria and Colby Lenz. We're members of an anti-carceral feminist group called Survived and Punished, and we organize defense campaigns on behalf of incarcerated survivors of domestic and sexual violence. And lately, since the shit show of COVID, we've had to organize emergency release campaigns pressuring the governors to free them all, hashtag free them all. So in order to assist the governor in doing that, we wrote up this mock pardon commutation certificate so that the governor just had to sign it. So in other words, he didn't have to do shit. All he had to do was sign this thing. So I also made like a 30-second clip to accompany the pardon and commutation certificate on how to sign the pardon. So this was sort of like a tutorial for Gavin Newsom. Here it is.
We'll now go to line number 262, 262. Your line is open. You're pretty trashy for relying on policy to not to continue transferring books to we're adamantly against this in Southern California, so you need to like change your policy about like and you need to start freeing everyone. I need you to call on Governor Newsom to close down immigrant prisons in our state because COVID is rapidly spreading in those areas. So yeah, you're just pretty trashy. Thank you.
And indeed, Governor Gavin Newsom has been pretty fucking trashy. So there's that. That was sort of a little bit of my organizer work that I'm doing now. And shout out to Survive and Punish. Check us out online and figure out how to help. I also wanted to share the larger focus of my multimedia work. And I have I guess the best way to convey what I'm going to show today is to talk about this long-term engagement that I have with sidelines, or the site of the margin, the sidelines, the minor excesses that spill out. I could keep going. Discarded parts, positions at the rear, and spaces and sites of surplus. So this video work that I made in the summer of 2018, oh, you can play it now, Derek. It's titled Turnaround Side Piece. And as I spin around, I'm referencing the gestures and positions of what I'm calling the side pieces of the history of art. So they're the subjects of nude art paintings. And they're sort of seen, or I'm seeing them also as discarded parts, objects at the sidelines of history. And I'm not necessarily, I guess, trying to rescue the side piece here. I'm just trying to acknowledge the site and the reality for many of us who are on the sidelines of the art market and in movement works too, in politics and in history. And also, I guess, the people off to the side of the bar, literally the side pieces. And speaking of the bar, that's my transition to the next work. This is, oh, you can go to the next one, yeah. This is work that I did in the summer of 2017, and it's called the Hookup Displacement Bar Hopping Drama Tour. And I led a bunch of strangers and friends on this drunken processional tour through 5 former sites of queer Latino and lesbian bars in San Francisco. We made a bunch of altars with dildos and panties and stuff, whatever people decided to bring that was associated with that space. We wrote messages on the walls of those venues, and I was able also to get 1990s footage of the people dancing in there from back in the day, and we projected it onto the club. I asked people to kiss the phantom walls of the beloved queer venues. I was trying to see if we could maybe, I don't know, resurface the spirits of the queer ghosts and those gentrified sites in San Francisco. And I also, as part of like trying to claim those spaces as our own, I also made these mock public notices of application for ownership change. And we posted these, you know, on the space before we went in to try to transform it, transform that current site into its former self. I'm just showing you a lot of stuff really fast. So recently, in the past 2 years, I guess I've been tinkering a bit more with sculpture. And I think this relates really well to the last project or performance project I just talked about. And I call these strobe light honeys. And they sort of hold the spirit of the side piece at the bar. They're sort of referencing archetypes of Black and brown exploitation, but also 1990s rave culture on the border. So these are just sort of like figures that are tainted with cigarettes. They have costume jewelry and chains, and I installed them to hang around, pose, and fall in their fabulous fur coats. And then also thinking about more side pieces and discarded parts, I recently photographed these gypsum casts of car taillights that I made. These are what I'm calling ass tassels. So I'm trying to think about, I guess subcultures are also on the sidelines. So I'm bringing together parts from stripper culture and car culture, seeing if I can invite the viewer to associate the human body and the auto body. And then I have this other work too, that's also related to car parts. And in this case, I guess trailer parts. And I guess there's some slippages here between inanimate matter and intimate body parts. It kind of looks to me like a hairy vagina. It's got some tongues, perhaps some pierced nipples, trying to see if I could represent those things that people think of as excesses associated with racialized feminine bodies. And then I threw in some titties, because why not? Here are some pasties that I made recently. And I think that's it. Oh, and I just want to thank Riley and Hentai for inviting me to be here. And I'm so happy to be among artists that I really admire. Thanks.
I guess I'm just going. Hey, it's Kent. Thank you for inviting me. I'm happy to participate in this panel today, and I've got 5 minutes, so I'm going to do my fastest artist talk ever. For the last couple of decades, I've spent a lot of time challenging how museums, colonial institutions across this continent have continued to perpetuate representations of Indigenous people that were created by settler artists beginning in the 19th century and a bit earlier. And so I've taken to task a lot of museums. My most recent project culminated with a large scale commission at the Metropolitan Museum in New York. And can you see that slide, please, Derek? It's 2 paintings called Wooden Boat People or Mistigosawak in Cree. And this project in many ways is the kind of the culmination of those 2 decades of, trying to articulate a response to these representations, these very subjective points of view of settler art history of this continent that was really a document, that really is a document of the disappearance of Indigenous people, the removal of Indigenous people from our lands. And so I've spent a lot of time looking at the paintings of artists like George Catlin, Albert Bierstadt, and many others. Can I see the next slide, please? I grew up in the city of Winnipeg, and as an Indigenous kid, I would go to the museum. This is a diorama in the Museum of Man and Nature in Manitoba, and I was really, captivated by this diorama as an urban Indigenous kid, on a school trip to a museum. And I remember my classmates, looking at me for answers when we stepped outside the museum, and there were Indigenous people on Skid Row lying in the streets. And inside the museum, you'd see this kind of time capsule representation of Indigenous people. Yet out on the streets, my people were strewn about, drunk in broad daylight. And they looked to me for some kind of answer, what happened? Well, as a kid, I had no way of articulating that. Next slide, please. This next painting was an attempt to bring that experience into some kind of artistic expression. And the violence perpetrated on Indigenous women, I decided to use Picasso's Cubist figurations of the female body to represent those bodies tumbling outside of those bars on Main Street. And that is based on a photograph I took of one of the bars on Main Street in Winnipeg. Next slide, please. I created a character, her name's Miss Chief Eagle Testicle, and she really is kind of center stage in a lot of my work. She represents Indigenous thinking about gender and sexuality. I wanted a character that could reverse the gaze, that could look at the European male and turn the gaze back. Indigenous people have been looking at Europeans as long as the Europeans have been looking at us. So I wanted this very empowered persona that could live inside the work and kind of, reverse the gaze. Next slide, please. So Miss Chief emerged at the McMichael Canadian Art Collection as a live performance character. And since then, I've been able to kind of cycle through a number of different periods of art history, notably, the 19th century where Paul Kane and George Catlin were making so many images of Indigenous people. Next slide, please. But since the museums continue to uphold their representations as these voices of authority, I realized that I had to also take on the museum itself. This is a painting by Paul Kane. It's called Medicine Mask Dance. And it's complete fabrication. None of these masks would exist. They're all from different nations. And so it was really, I wanted to draw attention to that with this project I did at the Royal Ontario Museum as a group exhibition from 2007. So I created an answer piece to this painting. Next slide, please. And it's called Duel After the Masquerade, where Miss Chief, confronts the artist Paul Kane and kind of topples his easel and storms off. So can I see the next slide, please? This was also, in this exhibition, I was forbidden to exhibit my painting along with Paul Kane's work in the First People's Gallery of the Royal Ontario Museum. And as a result, the curators invited me to create a performance, a response. And so I hosted a seance where Miss Chief could actually have conversations with Paul Kane and George Catlin, and I also wanted to talk to Delacroix, one of my favorite painters. And so in this conversation, Miss Chief talks to them, and they all respond in their own voices, in words from their journals about how they choose their subjects, their thoughts on color, and so forth. Can I see the next slide, please? And as Miss Chief, converses with each consecutive person, her headdress grows longer and longer. Next slide, please. Until finally she's speaking with George Catlin, and she takes him to task about his stretching of the truth, his artistic license, his biases, particularly in relation to one painting I found in his body of work called Dance to the Berdache, which was a representation of the two-spirit person, the Berdache who lived in the Sac and Fox tribes. And so this performance actually culminated with the resurrection of this dance, this honor dance to that two-spirit person. Next slide, please. And I planted some young male dancers in the audience who emerged, and I commissioned a piece of music called Dance to Mischief. And so the performance actually just ended with very much in a celebratory tone of decolonizing the space, decolonizing the museum that had censored me from the First People's Gallery, and then decolonizing the art history of George Catlin by bringing back this honor dance to the two-spirit person. And while he painted that image, he also wrote in his journals how he found it to be one of the most disgusting things he'd ever seen. So it was a moment, a high moment for for Miss Chief emerging as this character. I think there's one more image. And it eventually just culminated with the audience participating in the dance. So I'll just end my presentation there. Thank you.
So my name is Tourmaline, and first just wanted to express deep gratitude and appreciation for all the work that went into making this gathering possible. No matter how many Zoom talks or events or panels I attend or participate in, I'm always struck by, in the midst of the mess of a thing, how we figure out ways to come together in spaces, across vast stretches and time zones and conditions, and have them be accessible in as great a degree as possible. And so I'm just really appreciating all of that work and that labor, and also the invitation to be amongst some of my favorite artists. It's really a joy and a pleasure to be engaged in this way. So I'm gonna talk a little bit about my practice and a project that I'm doing right now that opens on Monday, which is next Monday, which is my first solo show called Pleasure Garden. And Pleasure Garden engages and really is a kind of culmination. I guess that's a word that a lot of us are using because it feels so real right now. We're at like a crescendo moment, and I think it's not a coincidence that our work reflects that. So Pleasure Garden is a culmination point of kind of years of work that I've been doing around freedom dreaming, which originates from the Black freedom movement. And a writer and theorist and friend of mine, Robin D.G. Kelly, wrote a really beautiful book about freedom dreaming. And the way that I think about it is in the Black freedom movement, which is also known as the Civil Rights Movement, that kind of was a legacy and lineage that was passed down to me by my grandparents and my dad, who were deeply ingrained in it. Freedom Schools happened, which was a gathering a co-creation of people trying to dream beyond what was there. And there were often three questions that were asked in freedom schools, which were, what does the dominant culture have that we want? What does the dominant culture have that we don't want? And what do we have already that we want to keep? And that third question has really added so much momentum to my work as an artist and my work as an organizer. Before I was engaged in kind of the art world, I was working for like 15 years as a community organizer with mostly incarcerated, mostly disabled, mostly low income, mostly people of color, largely Black and queer and trans people who were coming together around our basic needs, right? Whether it was freedom from police and prison or access to healthcare and welfare or housing, we were coming together in the midst of a mess of a thing to think about, you know, not only what do we not have that we want, or do we not have that we don't want, but what do we have already that we want to keep, that we want to grow more of? And it was from that place that I really started engaging and, you know, archiving the life of Marsha P. Johnson. And then me and my dear friend Sasha Wartzel came together and made a film, Happy Birthday, Marsha, about Marsha and kind of, you know, those small, intimate, daily acts of care, of resistance, of refusal, of dreaming that allow for and allow in the realization of the world that we need, or the earth that we need. And so from there, I made a film called Atlantic as a Sea of Bones with a dear friend, Egypt LaBeija, about the haunting of and the power of Black space. And it draws its name from a Lucille Clifton poem, Atlantic as a Sea of Bones, that talks about how spaces continue to be haunted by huge violences well after those supposed, you know, those violences are supposedly over, like the transatlantic slave trade. And so this was a story about Egypt LaBeija being on the pier, on the Christopher Street Pier in New York City, engaging in the past and dreaming up the future and being really alive in the now. And then from that place, I started a project about Seneca Village, which was a free Black community in Manhattan in a time in New York City when slavery was still legal. That, you know, was a place of refuge and sanctuary for people who were on the run, people who had a fugitive relationship to the state, who needed a place to land. It was a moment in, you know, in New York when, you know, quote unquote, free Black people were regularly kidnapped and sold south into slavery, even though also slavery was still legal in New York City. And so Salacia or Salasha, you know, there's no right or wrong way to say it, is really going back to my roots as like someone who was really into assemblage and collage, and making a film about Mary Jones, who was a Black trans person in New York City, who was born in 1803, who has a birthday on Saturday, December 12th, Sagittarius season. And was arrested for stealing someone's wallet. And during the process was, you know, really publicized and outed as trans in a pretty violent, extremely violent way, and called them a man monster. So New York City's kind of two big newspapers at the time, the Herald and the Sun, ran giant articles about her. And then there was a large portrait of her likeness. And while I was working on Happy Birthday, Marsha, and doing the research for that, I started learning about, you know, many Black, queer and trans, non-binary, gender outlaw people who came before. And so Mary Jones was someone who had just been with me for years. And I know I'm not alone in that. And so that story felt so important to tell. And it was in the vein of this kind of Black speculative storytelling, which is like, what if, you know, what if Mary Jones, who was on the run, landed in a kind of respectable Black neighborhood, which was Seneca Village. Like, how would that play out? And it was in the style of The People Could Fly, which are kind of Gullah stories that engage the science fiction, kind of surreal or speculative nature of Black storytelling. And so that is a little bit about Salacia. And then the Pleasure Gardens, which is a series of 5 self-portraits that are going to be a show that opens on Monday, is really kind of engaging in the idea of pleasure, not just as resistance, but as necessary, right? Beyond having a kind of relationship to the state and what we don't want, but really just grounded in what we do want. So Pleasure Gardens were places that during the cholera epidemic in New York City, there were places where people could go and have fresh air. And there were a number of, and this was like the 1830s, and there were a number of pleasure gardens that were Black owned. And so that, there was a lot of cruising and like public sex and hanging out and kind of really wonderful socialness and some other things that, people didn't want. And so the photographs really engage the story of what pleasure gardens were, what the kind of possibility, the freedom dream of those places were, and centers myself, which is something that I don't often do, as the subject of that story. And it's tied into a dream around space. So it's saying, these things that we often think are largely not possible or so far are actually much closer to us than we really might believe. And the way to kind of line up with the power of that, is this invitation to refocus our beliefs so they're in line with our desires. So similarly, Seneca Village happened at a time when Black people weren't being sold land in New York City and slavery was still legal. And yet people figured out a way to reform and reshape what they believed to be possible until they knew it wasn't only possible, but they were in the process of creating it. And so the show is about pleasure and pleasure gardens, as a way to kind of reshape and reform what we believe so they're aligned with our desires, so we know what we want isn't only possible, but we're in the process of creating it. And that's what I want to say now.
Thanks, you three. And again, apologies for having to condense your artist talk into a little bit of a diamond of artist talks. Before we get to the big themes of today's conversation, I want to start with a question about aesthetics, because discussions of politically engaged art, just as discussions of artworks with the intention to censor, can reduce art to sheer representation, and artworks are always much more than what they depict. So I'm going to go through you one by one, and I'll start in the same order that I've done before, and I'll start with Xandra. And Xandra, I read a conversation from last year with you and Livia Pastrana Santiago, in which you were so eloquent about your own work. And I thought I'd just read it, because it applies to so much of what I think many people would like to do. So we know artists' works embody their politics, the affects, poetics, vocabulary, and aesthetic approaches enact a practice of social critique from their respective social positions. Por ejemplo, I often view my own work / body as an unresolved split of juxtaposed meanings, a fleshy border encountering the interplay of humor, erotics, language, aesthetics, and time in halves. No solo una mitad, pero un montón de halves that refuse notions of wholeness. I use my work to orient myself and my politics. I love this image of a pile of halves, which makes me think, on the one hand, of Lorraine O'Grady's really incisive piece in Saturation about the diptych and the fact that Western dualisms are in fact hierarchical, as well as, when you talk about the fleshy border, it made me think of the question of borderland and Lorian Saldua, as opposed to the kind of neat split that would, that's in the fantasy of a Trump wall. So I'm wondering if you can talk a bit about your strategies and how you approach these unresolved or unresolvable equations, but also since you gave such a wonderful short insight or vision into your work, if you could talk about what each of the mediums that you work with, from performance through the sculpture, offer you in terms of your artistic and activist intention.
Yeah, I'm glad that you read that interview that I did with, who was that? With Movement Research with
Yes.
media. Yeah, I think I don't know. In terms of what does sculpture and performance do for? Sorry,
maybe how do you see each of the mediums that you work with? Like, what do they offer you? That for instance, why do you decide to do something, in a gallery setting, or something on the street, or or something as a net project?
Yeah, I mean, I think some of the things, maybe a way to answer this is that most of the work, I think even the sculpture stuff and definitely the performance stuff, I'm trying to produce what I understand as my own politic, like in the making. I think while I'm working with material, including my body as material, I start to find out what it is that I am thinking, what kind of knowledge I'm producing based on like the different types of violence that I experience on an everyday basis. It's not like I have to fantasize about violence, it's embedded in my life. It's embedded in my sexuality. It's embedded in my ways in which I think about pleasure, actually. And I think that's why I think and am informed by lots of sexual subcultures, and I participate in them because it's already encoded in there naturally. And so I'm using like the sculpture, I guess, and performance and video as a way to try to see if I can relay the not just aesthetic dimensions, but also the affective dimensions of the way it might the way they might come together in this body, or in a sculptural body. I think that that's maybe some of the things I'm trying to communicate, because even when I think about some of the sculptures that I have been working on, maybe I didn't show enough, but there's a sort of intensity that I like, and I like confrontational work. I like the sight of confrontation with the viewer. Anyway, that was kind of all over the place, but I hope that helped a little.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And in fact, we'll get back to some of these topics, such as the question of confrontation and the viewer later. Okay. But thank you so much. Mm-hmm. So I'll go on to Ken. Ken, I've taught your work for many years, and one of my favorite articles actually is Carrie Swanson's, now from I think 2005, The Noble Savage with a Drag Queen. And in that article, she cites James Luna on the opportunity of performance art and installation offered Indigenous artists. And Carrie writes, quote, "Performance art as a language and a discipline allows Native artists to speak in a language that is not the colonizers, and is closer to traditional Indigenous perspectives and worldviews as opposed to European." Your work, you work in performance and installation and film, as we've seen, but also with the risky business of actually taking on the legacy of Euro North American painting head on. And I was wondering if you could talk about your choice of medium also, but also your expressive, your means of expression in painting. When you were talking, and maybe want to hear more about, for example, putting Picasso with Kane.
Well, even though I work in other mediums, all of my work really serves painting in a way, because a lot of my inspiration comes from painting, and it is sort of my chosen primary medium. I know some artists, non-European or non-Western artists have chosen to reject, this entire canon of Western art. But objectively, as a Cree person, I look at the history of Western art, and I see value, obviously, in a lot of it, particularly in this very sophisticated language of painting. So rather than rejecting it, I was more interested in harnessing this language as an incredibly sophisticated form to communicate, and to use this language of the European settlers to provide and offer the alternate narratives that they erased from their own work. So for me, it was really about facing the challenge of bettering or matching, if not bettering, their work by creating the authoritative works that could stand in place for some of the works that were created to celebrate the settler heroes of this continent. And so I often talk about my work as wanting to offer alternate perspectives on the story of this continent that has obviously been told from the perspective of the settlers who came here to erase us and to disappear us from view. But performance, I love performance work. It brings another way of looking at the subject matter, and it does step outside of that canon, that Western canon, by disrupting it. And my performances are almost always in those colonial spaces. One of the images I showed in my presentation is Miss Chief in her teepee dress, almost as this sculptural work in, but the teepee itself being this dwelling inside this colonial institution. So, that's sort of how I think about it.
So you're actually working in the idiom of the museum through what is actually in a museum most of the time, which is the art museum is painting. Thanks so much. We'll come back again to also some of these themes that you're raising. So I'll now ask one question of Tourmaline, and then I'll open it up back into with everyone. And in Saturation, Tourmaline, you state that your film on Stonewall and AIDS activist Marsha P. Johnson, Happy Birthday Marsha, was a moment of, quote, pushing forth and centering a criminal aesthetics of the nobody, the people who have been discounted, who have been made to feel nothing. In Nylon, I also read the article in which you link your notion of criminal aesthetic to the sartorial laws that police gender and clothing as they affected Miss Major, the subject of your animated film, The Personal Thing. Your engagement with film, when I looked at some of your earlier work, and your first venture into the moving image was with Taking Freedom Home, which has the stylistic kind of urgency of activist video and DIY video. And then with Atlantic, The Sea of Bones, you employ the idiom of experimental media and performance. And then with Happy Birthday Marsha, you're using actors, you're using continuity editing, and you're using the incredibly lush cinematography of Arthur Jafa, who's, many of us in cinema know as with his association with people like Isaac Julian and John Comfort, with Spike Lee. He worked with Stanley Kubrick, and most famously perhaps when he launched his career with Julie Dasher's Daughters of the Dust. So I'm wondering if you could talk about your journey through film genres and aesthetics in developing a toolkit for your filmic criminal aesthetics of the nobody.
That's such a great question. Thank you for the brilliant question. It's funny, some of the things that I made came out in different, like in a non-linear way. So I went from making Taking Freedom Home to, which is on YouTube or Vimeo. I strongly suggest people watch that film. My friend Kagendo was the director for it, and the Welfare Warriors, which is the group I was a part of, and I was a campaign director for. We co-directed, co-produced it, and it was really about documenting our lives as people who were either currently low income or previously, grew up in poverty or, grew up low income, coming together to kind of make sense of our world together and do it and document it and talk about that. So I made that, and then I actually made Happy Birthday Marsha after that and shot it over a couple years. And in between doing that, I worked on this film called Mudbag that was directed by Dee Reese. And then AJ, Arthur Jaffa, and Sasha and I went back and shot more for Happy Birthday, Marcia. And then I made Atlantic of the Sea of Bones, but they came out in kind of reverse order. And so to me, you know, the Taking Freedom Home, we were largely living, you know, lives that were deeply regulated by the state, right? And so a lot of what we talk about that in it are like the challenges of going to Social Security for getting our Social Security disability check, or going to, there's going to be a cameo from my best friend in a second. And so a lot of it is just like, you know, it is the aesthetics of criminalization and the beauty of it. It's like us figuring out, you know, in the midst of a mess of a thing, like I say, you know, that we do have power, that we do have beauty. And then, you know, with Marcia, so at the time of Stonewall, just to put this together in less of a long form, at the time of Stonewall, there was a law in New York City. It was an anti-cross-dressing law. So it said, if you, for instance, were assigned male and you weren't wearing 3 articles of quote unquote male clothing, you could be arrested and put in jail. And to me, that is just such a powerful thing to think about, the regulation of aesthetics, right? The regulation of someone like a Miss Major or a Marsha P. Johnson, who knew the power of their aesthetics, who knew that, you know, their aesthetic choices, their creative, artistic choices were in a, they were on the run because of the choices that we're making, and they were powerful, and they pointed to the, you know, the kind of morals of the state as being much like, I don't want to say the word fragile as if it's a bad thing, but it's like, they were dust to dusting, right? Like if the state needed to regulate someone else's aesthetic, then the state's morals are clearly dust to dusting. You know, there's like no there. And so to me, I really wanted to make films that capture the beauty and the power of kind of our aesthetic that has power, that isn't dust to dusting. It's fully alive. It's very present in our now. And it's, and then, you know, I wanted to make it something that felt really beautiful. And I think that's where AJ came in and offered something in Geo Wife, you know, with the score, and Maya Taylor with the acting. And so to me, a lot of my film work is really about collaboration of relationships that I already have. So it's like AJ and I met in Scotland we were both presenting at a conference, and we got to know each other. And then Sasha I had known for years, and people who were part of like my organizing life ended up in Happy Birthday Marcia, and people who were doing, you know, Happy Birthday Marcia ended up in Maryville Fame and Salacia. And I think that's just, to me, it's about the power of community and the power of our aesthetic. So that's a long answer to a very beautiful question.
Thank you so much. And I think that for all of you, and I'll ask Xandra and Ken to join us again. If you can all turn on your cameras now. You know, there's a kind of radical beauty to the work that you all do, a kind of beauty of subversion and a subversive beauty. I began with a land acknowledgement, and they've become standard in all kinds of activist and artistic and academic gatherings in Canada. And there's a way in which they can become rote and mechanical, but I think that there's also, they play a really important role in reminding everyone, I mean, especially people like me who came to this country as a late teenager, about the ongoing reality of colonization, the history and because, you know, we're not in the afterlife of coloniality in Canada, we're living it today. And I'll just give you an example that just came out in the papers last week, that in, you know, one of the world's richest countries, there are 59 long-term drinking water advisories in First Nations reserves here. And in one community, members have had to boil their water since 1995. That's 25 years. And so, you know, these kinds of colonial land grabs and dispossession are still going on. We're seeing it today in China with, you know, an aggressive ethnic nationalism and expansionism, most notably deployed against the Tibetans and the Uyghurs, and of course in the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians that North American governments are very much implicated in. So I want to begin with a geopolitical question that asks you how land, place, territory, nation, space figures in your work and in your thinking about your work. And anyone can go. Sandra, you're smiling. So, I'm the kind of teacher who likes to point at students when I don't sit it with. So
no, but I was flirting. You're supposed to move away from the flirting student.
Well, no, I'm being subversive. I'm moving towards a flirting student because borders are right in your at the center of your work, right? And you talk about halves, and so it's a kind of a segue from your earlier question. If you could start.
Yeah, actually, I don't actually make a lot of work about the border, so I don't know if I am a great person to answer the question, but obviously the site of the border is significant to me because it's where I'm from and my family lives. But I just think of it as such a overburdened site in terms of the art market and the academy. And so I actually don't make a lot of work about it because it feels exploitative. And so I have not really made a lot of work about the border necessarily. And yeah, I mean, I think it just feels, I'm just trying to find other ways of being a border subject, I guess, that aren't connected to that sort of overdetermined and noble site that we understand as a border. And so I guess I'm not a great person to talk about that. But to say that there's a site that I do explore is what I mentioned earlier, like the site of sort of the margins and the site, and maybe the edge is the border, but when it has made it in my work, it's the border is more porous and unidentifiable. I don't really think of it as a fence or whatever, especially because I grew up there. The fence is just the violence is part of your lived reality, so yeah, that's what I have to say. Sorry if that didn't.
Yeah, no, that's great. I mean, I didn't necessarily mean you to speak specifically about the border, but it occurred to me at some point in terms of my own work that I realized that everything I do is about individuals navigating geopolitical space.
Oh, okay, right?
Yeah. So, and I think it may have to do with the fact that I'm doubly diasporic. But yeah, so Tourmaline or Kent, do you want to talk about land and space? And
a lot of my work actually is about land because it really speaks about the colonial project to remove us from our land. And currently in Canada, we occupy 0.2% of our own land. And a lot of my work deals about the personal story of my own family being ethnically cleansed from the Selkirk area in Manitoba. It was one of the largest land thefts in North America. And so I'm talking about the illegal occupation of Indigenous territories. I'm talking about the illegal theft of land. So I'm very conscious of borders, these arbitrary borders. I'm very conscious of the fact that I work on territory that is stolen, and land acknowledgements often feel hollow because really what they're saying is we're acknowledging that we took this land from you. And there's no act in place to actually to be in restitution to restore any of that land. So it's almost like a slap in the face when you hear it, because European modernity brought the values of amnesia. It's encouraged all of North America to forget that you're all on Indigenous territory, and so there's this constant reminder that that it is stolen land. European modernity just encouraged people to forget. And so a lot of my work has also been about cities. People forget that the cities they live in were also gathering places, trading places where Indigenous people gathered. So it's been a lot of my work's about dispossession. So it's the idea of land and dispossession of land is really at the core of my work.
Yeah, I think that I mean, why I said it's important, particularly for non-Indigenous people, the land acknowledgement, but because, I mean, I understand what you're saying, because, for example, within Canada, we've had truth and reconciliation process, and there's been a jump to the reconciliation without the truth and the reparation that's necessary to get to that reconciliation. Tourmaline, it may be less obvious. How do you think about where you work, the land in which you work, lands?
Yeah, I don't think it's less obvious at all. I mean, I think of three things. I think about my sibling Che Gott's scholarship that is really instrumental. Us remember that because of anti-Blackness, Black people are often constituted as other than Indigenous, and also the erasure of Black Indigenous people, and which like my family is descended from. I also think about Lucille Clifton talking during the transatlantic slave trade as central to the colonial project, right? So you can't have colonialism without, in the US, without the transatlantic slave trade. And that is what my film Atlantic Sea of Bones is about. It's about the haunting of these huge violence, right? And how they are continued to be reproduced, right? And the values and the morals of the state, which are dust to dusting and yet still reproducing them. And how, you know, Lucille Clifton's poem ends with this powerful invitation for us to listen, right? So it says, you know, when we listen, something awful answers. And so it's an invitation to actually acknowledge beyond a statement, but to acknowledge what is being reproduced, what we are reproducing, and you know, and to address it as a way to transform it, right? As a way to like look into the face of it. And so to me, I think that's been really always central to my work as an organizer and an artist. And also, I think that something that really is powerful in something like the Black freedom movement is saying, not only do we know what we don't want, we never got anything from, and we definitely don't want to reproduce, and we know that we were produced in, but what are our dreams offering, right? Our freedom dreams. And to me, that's where the scope of my work is going, is following our freedom dreams, knowing that some things are, you know, when you taste it, it's like you really need a drink of water because it's just so dry and dusty. And then some things are so lush, like the kinds of conversations that we're having today and the work of the two artists that I'm, you know, in Zoom in between. I don't know if it shows up like this in other people's screens, but like, that's how it looks on my screen. And so to me, there's a choice. It's like, do we want to go towards our dreams or continue to be reproducing what we were produced in that never offered us anything to begin with? And I think what is really inspiring is like the two people who I'm sandwiched between are really doing that in such a powerful way. So that to me is why I'm showing up here, and what I'm grateful for.
Thank you. I wanted to come to the, you know, this has been advertised as a conversation on art and politics, and I want to come to that question of art and activism. Artists have been central to, well, all of the activist movements that I know of in the last few decades, but particularly I think people associate artists very much in the foreground of, say, the AIDS movement, or also in Black Lives Matter. And I'm thinking of the role of artists in activism. This conversation with, you know, it celebrates the book, but it also focuses on, as Hentyle and Riley talked about, the various ways the political is navigated through art. and also the fact that artists don't necessarily, activist artists don't necessarily find parity across art and activism. So I was wondering how each of you sees yourself in terms of this notion of activist art, and what for you are the parities or the disconnects between art and activism? Don't be too polite. Just jump in, anybody.
I think we better just stick to the order that we've been going. So Xandra, you go first.
Oh, sorry. Okay. All right. I guess I usually I separate my organizer work, my organizer practice from my art practice. I don't know what I do. There are a lot of reasons, but I guess the primary reasons are that, like, it feels like my organizer work is not about the individual. It's not about me. You know what I mean? And so when I think about being an organizer, I think of myself as being part of a larger movement that is working in concert with, like, a lot of people working toward a similar goal, And so in that way, the practice is a shared practice with lots of people in conversation with legacies, histories that have shared goals, political goals. And so in my artwork, I don't really do that. I'm just like being a little loca here in my house, playing around with things, in my studio, in the world, experimenting with different ways of being, and aestheticizing my life in order to sort of think through aesthetics. And it's very personal and it's very individual, and it doesn't have any goals. I don't have any fucking end goals, and I don't even know what the fuck I'm making half of the time until it's done, And so I guess I'm making messy moves, with my desires as an artist. And then as an organizer, they're super strategic and they're very much in alignment with the movement. And so I tend to separate them completely. And of course, I mean, my artwork is informed by the movements that I've been part of for the past 20 plus years, but I don't, they're just separate. They just are for me.
So I guess, Ken?
Yeah, I think mine seem to be more intertwined in that a lot of my work is really about messaging about Indigenous experiences and histories that haven't existed in the canon, that haven't found a place in the museums. And I also feel like a lot of what I do is making efforts to create more space in these hallowed halls, these formal institutions, break down some of these barriers that have been there, that have put us off in those sidebar galleries, and that in doing so, it will make the path behind it easier for younger artists to move forward. And I think, I sort of see them intertwined. And then with my most recent exhibition that's been touring Canada, 9 venues, and I without setting about to do it, I found myself speaking to the average sort of Canadian about a lot of the messages that were in my work. And I found myself in this role of an educator just because people were so ignorant of Indigenous histories that I sort of had to assume that role, just out of the fact that most of the audiences, when I would, present my work, were just like wide-eyed with bewilderment, because our education system had never provided them any of the information. I mean, people are graduating from universities with degrees, have no idea. They have no idea what's happened. This is a genocide that's been perpetrated here, and it has been swept under the rug. And our communities are living proof of, intergenerational traumas. And I try to bring that out in my work, and I feel an urgency in my work to communicate that if I'm not doing that, I'm wasting time, because there are so many people in this country that are voting for governments without even thinking about the first people of this continent, without even thinking about the fact that we have just been displaced from our territories. And people ask me what they can do. I said, well, read the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and start thinking about who you're voting for, because your governments are fighting us on land claims. You're spending hundreds of millions of dollars fighting Indigenous land claims, for our own land. So I feel like all of those things are inherent in my work, and it's just, I feel like it's urgent, that when I think about my work, those are the kinds of messages that that are behind my work, like on a daily basis.
Thanks. Somebody disappear. Okay, there you go.
My cat Jean just woke up from a nap, and when they do that, there's just like no peace until they get some food. And so that an in between moments of, I come from, when I was like an organizer and I didn't think of myself as an artist, I had so much like funny disdain towards the art, people making art. I just thought, what is this about? This is like so not important. What's really important is, the campaign to do this. And then, I think that I realized that it was because I was seeing people creating and moving in the world in ways that I wanted to be, but I didn't know how to go about having that, right? Like, and some of the most brilliant artists who were around me were, people who were currently incarcerated or formerly incarcerated, making postcards, or making like the holiday calendars, or making the films that come home, kind of all of that work. And then I realized, oh, actually, like, we're all making art. There's just a kind of there's a certain group of people who might say, like, only this is art, right? Or only this is art. But actually, we've all been making art all the time, through our aesthetic, through how we show up, through how we're talking to each other, through how we're like moving through the world, on the pier, on the street. Like, this is all creative, and we're literally all in it together. And so to me, that line between, activist, organizer, artist has become much more blurry over time. When I think about what is more like defined as like an art world or an activist world, but the artist and the artwork, in like 2009, Diane Davies, who's a photographer, came out with all these pictures of Marsha Johnson, right? And for the 40th anniversary of Stonewall. And I just kind of really fell in love with photographs, and I started collaging from them. And I remember that was like a real impetus to finally say, I'm actually going to make a movie about Marsha, like seeing these photographs. And then I worked for Queers for Economic Justice at the time, and I would go to the office really early, and I would use their color printer. They're not around anymore, so it's okay to tell these stories. So like I would print all of my like collage stuff on their printer. And I would just like get to work really early and just like do all that stuff. And then I went to this place called the Art Students League, and you pay like $35 and take a class in Manhattan. And I would go there after work. And, it was really interesting because, there was something that was so creative and active about Queers for Economic Justice. We were making that movie together. I was using the resources to like collage. I knew that I wanted to be an artist. I didn't quite figure out what that meant, but I knew I wasn't it quite yet. And then I look back and I just say, well, we were just really all in it together. And I was just learning so much about what art can do in that time.
I think that your answers to that question all bring me to the question of value. And the subtitle of the book is, the circulation of value. And I'm thinking that for, for dealers, art dealers, the value of an artwork may be judged by, what price they fetch in an auction. For curators and gallery directors, it might be, the attendance of a show, the kind of reviews it it gets. And I'm wondering for you as politically engaged artists, how you judge the success or failure or ambivalence in terms of your own work. When do you consider something that you've done is successful? What is it doing? How do you judge that? I guess let's switch things around, and I'll start with Tourmaline, and then we'll go backwards. Can't you still be in the middle? Don't worry.
I think that's such the perfect question. It's about worth and value, which are, if you are like doing astrology, those are kind of like Taurus questions, right? What is the value of what we're producing? What are our values? How are we valued? What is our worth? What is our self-worth? And, to me, there's like a real revaluing process going on right now that is saying, actually, we come in with inherent value, and those of us who have been have no value at all or have been devalued are, there's a reckoning happening, right? And it's kind of across everything, including in kind of art institutions. And to me, it's a personal question too, because I had to, the process of being around really beautiful people, really powerful people, remember that that's what my art is about. It's like remembering that we matter, right? After being told and conditioned to believing that we didn't, and that we don't. And so that to me is at the heart of a question around value, whether it's my art or my life or my relationships. And I try to do that really publicly. That's part of my practices, like practice of publicly remembering who I really am, right? Which is someone who came in with inherent value. There is no work that I could make that would be a failure, right? Like it all has value. There's some work that further clarifies work that I want to be making in the future, and I wouldn't want to do again. There's a lot of experiences that I wouldn't ever want to repeat, but they were of value and that they helped me figure out the kind of experiences that I do want to have. And so to me, that's kind of how I assess my work, is it's all important. It's all either getting the jackpot, like the 777 on a thing, or it helps me to further clarify what I want to do in the future. And honestly, the more that I make work, the more I don't want the 777 jackpot. I want to really clarify where I'm going and how I want to approach it and how I want to approach a new thing, because it's just more, it feels more alive to me.
Thanks. And how do you think about your own work? What kind of criteria do you use to assess your own work?
So I think I agree with Tourmaline. I think there's as artists, everything we do has this inherent value because it's all process, right? For me, I think of my art practice as my pathway to learning and to just arriving somewhere more informed or more engaged or just, I don't know, there's this process so everything I do, even if I don't like the end result, there's that inherent value of having made it, and you learn from that. Externally, the works that I value are the ones that reach people, that move people, that somehow shatter people, or you can just get a sense of certain works, and sometimes you can't predict it, or you don't know what will be that piece that just disrupts or has that impact, and those are the ones that I see that have that external value. But everything for me, just I sometimes I just have to make the piece, and then it might not mean anything to anybody else, but it has that value to me.
Thanks. Xandra.
Okay. Wait, what was the question? Stoner girl.
How do you assess your own work? If you think of some pieces being more successful than others, etc.
Yeah.
The framing question was around the circulation of value and how different I guess different people might judge in the kind of art ecology might judge works differently, judge the value of works differently. And how do you, as an artist, in thinking in terms of being a political artist, think about your own work?
I mean, I think that probably, I mean, I don't think that I have been like rendered or whatever, like transparent to the art world or like museum and gallery connoisseurs. So I haven't been collected or bought, or my work, haha, slip of the mind. But that I think maybe I'm having that slip a little bit because like I think of the ways in which artists are part of, you know, stables, like galleries that represent them. They're literally called stables. They're seen as like kind of a little bit like animals. And so, you know, we all know the relationship that museums have had with collections as a sort of colonial and imperial practice. And I think that if I try to tell myself this, I still, you know, want to be out there and people to engage me with my work in art context. But that hasn't necessarily emerged for me. But I tell myself that you know, that it is a colonial practice, that, you know, I haven't, like, there is a sort of anthropological aspect and nature to the collection of certain works, and that maybe I don't want to be part of that repository or something. I don't know. Yeah.
I think that's what you're saying actually holds true for me. And I realized after teaching in an art school for, you know, a number of years that my work began to change, and I began to think of my work in terms of those kind of more conventional markers of success and more conventional places to place the work. And I think that I had to step back and realize what was going on, and then come up with different kinds of means of thinking about the work, which brings me to my next question, which is around pedagogy. In preparing for this conversation, I went back to one of my very favorite articles, one that really formed me, which was by Cobina Mercer in his I See a collection from, I think, 1988, Black film, British cinema. And he talks about the new work that was being produced then, which is, you know, work of Sankofa and the Black Audio Film Collective, which produced Isaac Julian and Donna Comfort most famously. And he talks about the way in which Black filmmakers were now getting funded, but they were getting funded to speak for their communities. That's the way that they were being pressured or thought about. And he was saying that what these works are doing is it's actually speaking from communities, they're shifting, not speaking for, but from. And as an artist, one of the things that interests me is speaking to communities, speaking to the communities that I see myself belonging to. And I think that that actually can shift your work. So rather than speaking from a minoritized position, always to the dominant, which is, I think, what a lot of works do. Like, I remember the work, I used to be a film distributor of activist documentary, and I know that a lot of the work from the 60s and 70s actually spoke on racism would speak to a white subject position, or the work on homophobia would speak to a straight person. Right? So I'm wondering how you think about speaking to community, to your own community. How do you think about activating? How does your work activate? Xandra, do you want to start? We go back again.
Okay. I remember that article. I think it was like the burden of representation, right? Or
exactly, the burden of representation.
Yeah. So, oh God, I'm such a stoner. Yeah. So, I do experience that burden, I guess. And, you know, I think also, you know, I talked about this when we were on the panel together, and last year, I think, or maybe 2 years ago, about the burden of having to represent particular communities, and the ways in which the communities want to be seen in a positive light, you know, or maybe be seen as like getting it right. Like, what is the right representation here? And so that burden runs deep, I think, for a lot of non-white folks, and it is indeed a burden. And, I think that that's maybe why I have such an incompatibility with my activist practice and my work too. I don't want to represent, Chicanas or people on the border as this undifferentiated mass of sameness. There's so many different types of people that I am a part of, communities that I am a part of, and I don't want to be burdened with representing them in my work. I'm not, it does indeed feel like a burden, so it just feels like a type of what I call the stuck status, like, in the visual, where we get stuck with this certain thing about how we're supposed to be represented. So anyway, yeah, that's, I don't know if I answered the question, but I'm just adding sort of banter to it.
Well, if I can just push that question a little further, which is, what would you say, or how does your work attempt to address the Chicana, rather than represent them, or how do you what does your work want to say to them?
Oh, I don't know if I'm saying anything to them, but I think when I was doing in the early 2000s, when I was doing performance work under the banner or the alias of La Chica Boom, the work had a lot of Chicano signifiers that I played with. And I was sort of trying to make a caricature of like, what is a Chicano? I'm not sure that the work read that way. I think people saw it as empowering, but I was actually talking about the limitations of the representations of Chicanidad. They're trapped and stuck in these signifiers. So yeah, I guess I don't know that I was addressing the Chicano community, but addressing the problem of representation and the limitations of Chicanidad, like visually, within that work specifically.
That's precisely what I was going for in my question. Thanks so much.
Oh, okay.
Ken, what do you say to an Indigenous viewer of your work?
Well, okay. So first of all, I really, my work is really to be representative of my own personal experience and my own views, and those happen to be informed by the fact that I come from a certain community, and people in my community have shared similar experiences. So I'm trying to articulate my own experience and my own family's experience and people close to me. But I'm not an elected, person to represent anybody other than myself. So, but having said that, I want to speak to the world. Why would I want to just speak to a very small community? I want to relate the experience of myself, of being of certain time and place, to the world, because many people in the world have no idea what's happened within the borders of this country. People in Europe don't understand anything about colonialism. So I'm not interested in just speaking to my immediate community. Of course, I'm interested in speaking to the indigenous community, but it's like preaching to the choir. I want to speak to the settler communities that have created these colonial policies, but then beyond that, I also want to reach other people around the world and say, do you know that this is happening? Like, this is something that you should know about.
Yeah, I think I need to make a distinction between, say, audiences in terms of film, which is what I do, audiences and address. Because, coming from a minoritized position and, say, growing up in a small island in the Caribbean, you'd see the Caribbean represented, but people would have, they would have African-American actors doing the weirdest accents, like what island did this person come from, right? So there's a way in which, when I come to doing my own work, I wouldn't use the word authenticity, but there's certain kinds of things that I feel like I have to get right. Because I started one of my films with my mother singing a song in the Creole, Trinidad, the French Creole, African French Creole, and it's not translated, because I particularly wanted to address audiences who are never spoken to, but are spoken about. So that's the kind of question that I was thinking about. But I'm sure that you also feel like there are certain kinds of things that you have to get right, that people say, like, he's talking to somebody else and he doesn't care about us.
Well, that's it. And that's about, creating layered work, right? So there's
Yes.
layers of different people. And embedded in that work are almost like coded messages that, people close to you, people who understand your experience will understand immediately, and other people outside won't. But it's, great art for me is always layered, and there's always those layers, whether they're art history layers or they're like, whatever those layers are. And I think just like layered work is what I strive for.
Thanks so much. And Tourmaline, I see that the time is coming to an end, so I'm afraid you will have to be brief, but I'm really interested in hearing what you have to say on this too.
I think that everyone who spoke before me, I can't add to that. Layered work and beyond but not without, and releasing the burden and the resistance.
Thanks so much.
Yeah.
So, and here's Andrew to wrap things up. I had a whole bunch of questions. You three are so brilliant. Your work is so brilliant. We didn't get to everything another time, but thanks so much.
Thanks, everybody. That was fun. Are we done? Can I flash you with my boobs? No, just kidding. Can I do that?
Maybe wait a moment or two. But all good.
Late.
Too late. It's on there forever on YouTube.
Ever and ever.
Incredible. I couldn't ask for a more memorable ending. You all are fantastic. Thank you so much. Thank you, Richard, for moderating. Thank you to each of the artists. Thank you to the editors. And of course, there is this book. So if you haven't already gotten a copy, which include contributions from each of these wonderful people, you can do that online from the New Museum store. Thank you, everyone. We look forward to seeing you again soon.